Welcome to a talk about two special women in Sarasota history, Mrs. Carrie Spencer Abbe and Mrs. Rose Phillips Wilson. Both women were without husbands at a fairly young age and went on to create and embellish their own careers at a time when few women had leadership positions outside their home. Setting the stage. Before listening to this presentation, try to focus on what Sarasota was like in its early years. In a lot of ways, it was like camping out with no modern equipment, conversation and meals over the campfire, drawing water from a well, freshwater spring, or from a rain cistern, the smell of outhouses, having to go some distance to a post office up to 3 times a week because there was no mail delivery. Gunshots were normally heard nearby when men would shoot game for their dinner. There were few doctors in the area, and the nearest hospital was in Tampa. It almost sounds like pioneering. Oh, that's right, it was. Visitors coming to Sarasota had to ask for directions because there were no street signs and no addresses on the buildings. Many homesteaders came into town for supplies, trading with truck farm produce and animal hides instead of cash. In-town residents were discouraged in keeping up their yards because cattle, hogs, and chickens would roam through the streets and yards. Church gatherings, with or without the buildings, were the social centers of the county, and most of them met once a month with traveling preachers. The river towns like Bradentown, Palmetto, and Manatee were 10 to 15 years more advanced socially and economically, and were the centers of commerce. Mrs. C.V.S. Wilson wrote a brief on women's legal status and rights in 1913. It seems in Florida a woman lost a part of her rights when she got married, but could file a request for a license to be a free dealer, which would be published in the newspaper. If successful, she then could manage her own estate. We are going to start talking about Mrs. Carrie Spencer Abbe. But first, I want to clear up a common misconception. Charles E. Abbe, the first postmaster of Sarasota, had a daughter named Carrie A. Abbe. That is not who I am presenting today. Carrie A. Abbe, sometimes known as Carolyn, married an Austrian who arrived at the same time as the Scots, Anton Kleinschegg. She became Mrs. A. Kleinschegg, moved to Austria until he died, and then moved to Elgin, Illinois with her mother. Myron R. Abbe, Carrie Spencer Abbe's husband, was a cousin of Charles E. Abbe. If you haven't heard the story, Charles Abbe was assassinated by a member of the Sarasota Vigilantes, and his body dropped into the Gulf of Mexico, never to be found. After the trials of the Vigilantes, Charlotte R. Abbe became the postmaster for about 2 years before the post office was moved to Lower Main Street. Myron R. Abbe and Carrie Spencer married in Connecticut, and probably on the recommendation of his cousin Charles Abbe, they moved to what is now Sarasota. Carrie said the building they moved to was the old Lacey place, which could be interpreted as a house on today's Morrill Street. The Story of Sarasota by Carl H. Grismer gives a doctor title to Myron to mean that he was a dentist. I found no reference in the newspapers of the doctor title or that he performed any dentistry in Sarasota. The Story of Sarasota also stated that he invested in the FMIC, or Florida Mortgage and Investment Company, the Scott Company managed by J. Hamilton Gillespie, and was very disappointed with that investment. It looks like Myron did some truck farming as he sold pepino melon plants to locals and through the mail in 1889. As many wives did in the Sarasota summer while their husbands tended their business or farm, Carrie spent the summer of 1890 with her relatives in South Carolina. The following summer, Mr. and Mrs. Myron Abbe were reported at the seashore, which probably means they rented a cottage on Sarasota Key, now known as Siesta Key. After Carrie became the new postmaster, Myron became the Manatee County agent for the Singer Sewing Machine Company and set up his office at the post office. While Carrie spends her time with the mail, Myron spent the summer of 1892 in Connecticut, his old home. In 1894, Myron and Carrie buy a lot and build a house near the corner of Mango Avenue, now Central, and 8th Street, now 2nd Street. Carrie lived in that house until 1922. Myron does well with Singer, and in 1895 he was awarded a gold watch for being their most successful agent in Florida. Unfortunately, by 1898, Myron had left Manatee County and Carrie. I did not see any divorce notifications, so I assume he abandoned her. Since the post office was Carrie's career, I wanted to share its history in Sarasota. Like I stated earlier, Charles Abbe was the first postmaster of Sarasota from 1878 until he was murdered in December of 1884. According to Edge of Wilderness by Janet Snyder Matthews, he built a house and store on Osprey Avenue and Arlington Street and called it Helena. When he got the commission of postmaster, he placed the post office inside his store. This location was close to Post Office Point, where the mail was delivered by boat. Matthews notes that Abbe was planning on calling the post office Helena, but decided on the name of the bay instead, Sarasota. After he was murdered and members of the Sarasota vigilantes were rounded up and a number were put on trial and several convicted, during these trying times, Charles' wife, Charlotte, who had been threatened before by members of the vigilantes, did not continue running the post office. It instead was run by Sam Corwin. After the trials, Charlotte became the postmaster for about 2 years. This slide shows a view of the corner of Osprey Avenue and Arlington Street. The red star is the approximate position of the Abbe home, store, and post office. Note, Charles Abbe also had a homestead and had built a second house near the roundabout on Tuttle, where Charlotte was threatened before Charles' murder. As mentioned before, Sam Corwin took over the post office for about 6 months. Sam Corwin had a homestead across Philippi Creek from today's Riverside High School. That would be the logical place for the post office, but I've also heard rumors that the post office was run on or near Cunliffe Lane, close to where Charles Abbe was murdered. This is a picture of the approximate area of Sam Corwin's homestead. Again, did the post office move here for 6 months or Cunliffe Lane? The Scotts arrived in December 1885, and the company behind them, the FMIC, or Florida Mortgage and Investment Company, started building a town. Roads were grubbed, buildings built, and families settled. Lower Main Street was for the most part the epicenter of the new community. The Whitaker brothers, having a store on Lower Main, decided to request the post office move to their store. They were successful, and Charles C. Whitaker became the new postmaster. During the next 2 years, the building boom slowed and stopped. Charles unsuccessfully ran for county superintendent, and he married Sue Whitcomb, a Sarasota school teacher. Families were leaving Sarasota, and the Whitcomb family left for Tampa. Charles Whitaker and his wife soon followed. Richard Scott took over as postmaster, who kept the post office in the Whitaker brothers' store. This slide shows Lower Main Street about 1903 and the Whitaker brothers' store, which for a long time was one of the 2 stores in Sarasota. The post office was moved here in 1887. Richard Scott was removed as postmaster in November 1890 and replaced with Robert Greer, Sarasota's Justice of the Peace, who moved the post office to his residence on North Pineapple Avenue near 7th Street, today's 1st Street. He put in a mail slot on his front door for accepting mail after hours. Unfortunately, he died in October 1891. The postmaster's widow normally takes over for her late husband. However, Mrs. Greer was not qualified to keep the post office going. J. Hamilton Gillespie took over the postmaster task until Mr. Greer's sureties, C.L. Reeves and George Tatum, appointed Mrs. Abbe. Mrs. Abbe, as postmaster, rented the space in the Greer house for a year. The post office, based on size, revenue, and pieces moved, was considered at this time a fourth-class post office. The mail came to Sarasota 3 times a week. Mrs. Greer's house was eventually bought by C.V.S. Wilson, the editor of the Sarasota Times. The mail slot remained in the door for many years. This is a portion of a 1913 Sanford map of Sarasota showing the approximate location of the Robert Greer house and future Mrs. Rose Wilson home. The description I have is on North Pineapple Avenue near 7th Street. The Sanford map was created for insurance purposes to determine insurance rates. The postmaster for a small post office had to supply the office space, so when Mrs. Greer sold the house, Mrs. C.S. Abbe rented a space in the back of George A. Cayson's large store at Gulfstream Avenue and Lower Main Street. The post office started selling money orders in November of 1892. Money orders became a large part of the post office business. Monthly sales of money orders for the month of January of 1898 totaled only $78.85, whereas the same month in 1922 amounted to $8,159.95. It was noted that only the enforcement of the liquor law reduced the sales of money orders. These pictures show the building George Cayson used for his store, once the Florida Mortgage and Investment Company store, on Gulfstream Avenue and Main Street. This part of Lower Main Street was considered the foot of Main. You can see that Main Street was still a sand road. This screen shows a 1913 Sanford map of the area. The red star indicates the location of Cayson's store. In 1899, Harry Heigl wanted to bring telephones into Sarasota. He needed a place to house a single communal phone and a person to answer and manage it. He offered Mrs. Carrie S. Abbe a room for the post office if she would manage the communal phone. He built a wooden building at 5 Points that housed an office for him and a room for the post office and telephone. When a call came through to anyone in the town, Carrie was expected to hurry through the community and bring the party to the phone. When that wasn't possible, she was expected to take the message and deliver it. A second line was installed at Heigl's office at the pier. The mail was not delivered at this point, so post office boxes were the method of distributing mail to year-round citizens and some seasonal visitors. Heigl's shack had more post office boxes than Cayson's store. In October of 1903, Peninsular Telephone, the new telephone company, installed a telephone exchange for 45 telephones in the wooden building with Mrs. Abbe in charge. Carrie Abbe hired Miss Mamie Woodruff as the first operator. 1903 was the year when the railroad came to Sarasota, and soon afterwards, mail came in twice a day by rail. This screen shows the first Peninsular telephone directory for Sarasota, dated November 1903. J. Hamilton Gillespie wanted to have a bank in Sarasota, but was advised that a bank would not come to Sarasota until there was a building suitable for a bank. Since he owned the lot where the post office and telephone exchange building were located, he had that building moved into the street in early 1905 and started building his artificial stone 2-story building known as the Gillespie Block. When the building was complete late in 1905, Peninsular Telephone moved the telephone exchange upstairs with new switchboards, and the post office went to the Pineapple Avenue side of the building. In 1911, the government had Sunday work and the post office discontinued, except for an hour with limited general window service. The post office was rated as a third-class post office at this time. At last, in June of 1911, Carrie was allowed to hire a clerk at the post office, Harry Register, but had to pay part of his salary. Also, the postmaster pay in Sarasota was increased from $1,300 to $1,500 a year. By 1911, the Sarasota post office had 161 post office boxes. This is a picture of the post office facing Pineapple Avenue. In 1910, Mrs. Bertha Palmer, her sons, brother and father, had explored the possibilities around Sarasota and had started two companies, the Sarasota Venice Company and the Palmer Florida Company. Recognizing that Sarasota needed a larger post office space, the Palmer Florida Company built a red brick two-story building on Upper Main Street between Pineapple Avenue and Lemon Avenue. The post office, with a new 5-year lease, was moved into that building. The number of post office boxes increased to 280. A few years later, more space was needed, so they expanded the building. In 1916, Mrs. Abbe was able to hire 2 more clerks to handle the additional workload. Again, part of their salaries she had to pay. After World War I, the government required the post offices to sell government surplus food until their allotments had been met. Here are 2 pictures of the post office building. During World War I, 1917, the government sent large 9-foot by 7-foot U.S. flags to all the post offices. Since there was no flagpole at the post office, she hung the flag on the wall inside the post office. In January of 1920, the Sarasota Post Office started its free mail village delivery service twice daily. Patrons were required to install a mailbox at their house and have an address posted. In March of 1921, rural delivery routes to Fruitville started. Between 1912 and 1917, post office business in Sarasota increased by 55%. And between 1917 and 1922, another 38%. By 1921, the Palmer, Florida building did not have the capacity for the increased activity, and in August, the post office moved to the Cummer Arcade on Pineapple Avenue, which provided more space and another bank of post office boxes. At the same time, the first mail collection boxes were installed at Main and Gulfstream, Main and Rawls, Orange and Alderman, Mango and 12th, and Pineapple and 4th Street. In 1922, Mrs. Carrie Spencer Abbe turned 65 and became too old to take the civil service test and was forced to retire. During her tenure, she never took a vacation. This slide shows the Cummer Arcade next to the Gillespie Block on Pineapple Avenue. On the other side is the Methodist Church, and behind is the Peninsular Telephone Building and the Miramar Hotel. Here's another picture of the front of the Cummer Arcade with the post office in the back of the building. This is a portion of the Sanford insurance map dated May 1925, showing the position of the post office within the Cummer Arcade. When Mrs. Abbe was about to retire, there were many accolades from the citizenry. The 2 partial accolades I have listed were from J. Hamilton Gillespie, the mayor of the town of Sarasota for many years and a Manatee County leader, and Augustus M. Wilson, the Myakka postmaster, statesman, and cattle baron, who worked with Mrs. Abbe almost daily in receiving mail from Sarasota. Mr. Gillespie states, "Year in, year out, she was at her post, always courteous, always efficient. Sarasota was indeed fortunate in its postmaster. I do not think that there are in Florida many postmasters with such a long, unbroken term of service as Mrs. Abbe has, and I am sure there are none with a better record." Mr. Wilson states, "Mrs. Carrie S. Abbe, who retires from the post office next week, is one of the most honored and perhaps the most generally loved women in the county, perhaps in the state. She has given more than 30 years of the prime of her life to the service of the people of Sarasota as postmaster and retires only because of her advancing years, which makes her no longer eligible to reappointment. Her life is closely entwined with the growth, history, and vicissitudes of Sarasota. The moral, social, and religious status of the town and the people have been greatly advanced and improved by reason of her long active residence here, and she gracefully retires from office with the people's love, respect, and admiration that knows no bounds." You would think that with all the activity going on at the post office and its requirements, that Carrie would not have time for anything else. She loved people, especially the youth of the city. She would organize picnic excursions on sailboats to different places of interest. She hosted weddings at her house on 8th Street. She provided room and board to seasonal visitors and worked hard for the Presbyterian Church Woman's Auxiliary. She was one of the first to join and a leader in the Town Improvement Society from 1903 to 1907, and was an honorary member in the Woman's Club, 1913. This is a picture of one of Mrs. Abbe's excursions to Benjamin Stickney's homestead on Sarasota Key, now Siesta Key. This was one of the favorite picnic trips because the group could walk a short distance to the Gulf Beach. Here's a picture of Mrs. Carrie Spencer Abbe and her mother, Mrs. Isidore Spencer. Mrs. Spencer and her parrot lived with Carrie for many years until her death in 1929. Mrs. Abbe died in 1940. Both were buried in Rosemary Cemetery. This is a photo of Mrs. Carrie S. Abbe's home on the corner of 8th Street, now 2nd, and Mango Avenue, now Central. It appears to be her mother, Mrs. Spencer, in a rocking chair on the porch. In 1922, Mrs. Abbe had a house built on East Main Street near the golf course and sold this one. This slide shows two 1913 sandboard maps demonstrating where Mrs. Abbe lived. Again, Mango is now Central and 8th Street is now 2nd Street. Notice the Baptist Church is across the street. 5 Points is 2 blocks to the south. Now we'll be talking about Mrs. Rose Phillips Wilson. Rose Phillips was born at Prince Edward Island, Canada in 1877 and was educated in the public school of Charlottetown. Her Scotch parents were John Crichton and Isabel Hyslop Phillips. Her father was a boat builder from Dundee and her mother was from Glasgow. They moved to Florida and homesteaded in the early 1890s. Rose finished her schooling at the Manatee County High School at Bradentown in 1897, winning a prize for scholarship excellence. While working at the Manatee Advocate newspaper, she married, in 1898, the editor and owner of the paper, Cornelius Van Sanford Wilson, CVS Wilson for short. He was a widower at age 61 and Rose was 20. She continued working for the newspaper after they were married. A year later, CVS Wilson moved the newspaper to Sarasota and renamed it the Sarasota Times. They opened operations in a wooden building on Lower Main Street owned by J.L. Iverson, sometimes Americanized as Iverson. They bought a house on North Pineapple near today's First Street, mentioned earlier as the site for the post office. Mr. Wilson was a Democrat and had sparring editorials with other county newspapers. He was also Justice of the Peace. In 1910, C.V.S. Wilson, knowing the illness he had would lead to his death, wrote his last editorial to be published when he died. He knew that not everyone would accept that his wife, Rose, would become the new editor of the paper, so he asked the Florida press to accept her as they had accepted him so many years before. She attended the Florida Press Association meetings every year thereafter until she sold the paper. When he was on his deathbed, Rose looked after him, and the newspaper was put out by Charles Hebb, a ninth grader, who they had been training. He was assisted by Miss Mary Mercer. For a small country weekly newspaper, it was hard to get qualified help. Rose at times did not have enough workers to get the paper out on time, and she complained about the price of paper, ink, postal costs, etc. When she took over, the annual subscription rate was $1. She raised it to $1.50 a year in 1916, and then because of costs had to raise it again in 1920 to $2 per annum. As mentioned in the prior slide, the Sarasota Times started in the Iverson wooden building on Lower Main Street. John Iverson family used to live in Sarasota, owning this building and another on Gulfstream Avenue. In 1899, he lived in Tampa. The picture shows Rose and C.V.S. Wilson in the doorway of the Sarasota Times building, owned by J.L. Iverson of Tampa. When it was built in 1886, it was intended to be a store with rooms upstairs. It has served as a residence, a dance hall, it held Sunday school and church services, was a packing house, and of course, housed the Sarasota Times. In 1911, Iverson started building a two-story concrete block building and had to move the old wooden building using rollers to the alley. The Sarasota Times stayed in the alley while Mr. Iverson built a second story to the block building known as the Iverson Block. The two 1913 Sanborn insurance maps showing the Iverson block buildings, solid black or blue, and the red star indicates where the Sarasota Times building was moved to, next to the alley, so that the Iverson block building could be started. The building was on rollers, printing equipment included. When the second story was finished, the Sarasota Times office moved into the Iverson block, February of 1912. The old building was sold, torn down, and carried to Osprey Avenue across Hudson Bayou and incorporated into Mr. McKean's house in May 1914. This is a current picture of the Iverson block that the Sarasota Times office hosted. It is located on Lower Main Street between 5 Points and Palm Avenue. Here is another current picture of the Iverson block, built 1911 to 1912. This is a picture of the Tonnelier building containing the Palms Hotel, Palms Theater, and other businesses. The Iverson block building is to the left under the red star. In March 1915, after midnight, a fire started at the corner of North Pineapple Avenue and Main Street, spread to the Tonnelier building, which was thought fireproof, and totally consumed the building. As the wind pushed the fire southward, the Iverson block building suffered scorches but did not burn. Mrs. Rose Wilson was busy taking as much out of the Sarasota Times office as she and helpers could. Luckily, the office was not destroyed, and she spent the day returning items back to the building. The newspaper stayed in the Iverson Block building through fire and war, and in 1921 Rose could afford to buy her own building and lot. She bought the Rigby building at the corner of Lemon Avenue and Main Street across from the train depot and moved the newspaper and renamed it to the Sarasota County Times, as this was the time Sarasota County came into being. The title for the property was the first one issued in the new Sarasota County. Here are pictures of the 1913 and 1925 Sanford insurance maps showing the location of the Sarasota Times building across the street from the train depot on Lemon Avenue. Although I couldn't find a period picture of the Sarasota Times building, I found this one probably in the 1940s or 1950s, showing what looks like the same building across the street from the train station. Here is a newspaper clipping of January 1923 of the planned upgrade to the Sarasota Times building. This was after Rose Wilson had sold the paper. Note, today there is a building on First Street near Tamiami Trail that originally was called the Sarasota Times Building and has the incorporation date of 1899. Mrs. Wilson never occupied this building. A Mr. Regan in 1924 bought the Sarasota Times, had Dwight James Baum design the building, Owen Burns built it, and L.D. Regan moved the Daily Sarasota Times into it. Mr. Regan's house was behind this building on Palm Avenue. Here are current pictures of the Sarasota Times building, designed by Dwight James Baum, the architect of Cadizan, built by Owen Burns for Mr. Regan in 1924. Note the established 1899 indicating the Sarasota Times started in that year, but not in this building. After CBS Wilson's death in 1910, Rose was progressive in improving the Sarasota Times. At the end of that year, she changed the format of the paper to not use pre-formatted material and to institute home print, which was more work but gave her more flexibility. Posted is an article from the Sarasota Times dated December 1910 explaining about canceling the Ready Print service, which pre-printed the outside pages, and asking indulgence until they could convert to home print. To make the production of the newspaper more efficient, Rose updated the printing press in February 1912 and the folding machine in February 1913. The screen has a picture of the Babcock press and the Sarasota Times article about adding the Omaha folder machinery. Rose made an additional improvement in January 1916 by adding the Mergenthaler linotype machine. After World War I was over and after she raised the price of an annual subscription to $2 in 1920, she was able to install 3 electric motors for the linotype and job presses. Displayed is an article from the Sarasota Times from January 1916 about the installation of the linotype machine. Rose Wilson noted that some of the county newspapers were going semi-weekly or daily. She published in January 1923 her reason to sell the Times as unable to secure sufficient support to change the Times to a semi-weekly, and with a practical knowledge of the newspaper field, we knew the time was inopportune for the establishment of another paper, so rather than impose this burden on the businessmen, we have but followed the example of other Florida papers by selling out to those who were prepared to enter the field and give the town a better newspaper service than we could. The Claremont Press newspaper thought Rose received $50,000 for the paper and business. If so, she had a nice retirement. Mrs. Wilson, from my point of view, didn't write a weekly editorial. She didn't have strong political beliefs, and she let some of the topics be addressed by the Women's Club, the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, American Legion, etc. However, when the topics were hotly talked about, she would jump into the fray. I've listed some of the topics that received editorials. Although Rose tried to make a profit with the Sarasota Times, she had to, or volunteered to, give free print to birth and death records, Women's Club write-ups and ads. She may also have given space for some religious articles and ads. After World War I, Rose thought the high war prices of printing supplies and postage would go down. However, they remained the same and some actually climbed. Subscribers would not always pay on time and sometimes not at all. Her other area of revenue, the ads, seemed plentiful, but she still fought with the bills. Around 1920, there appeared a cartoon that seemed to express her frustrations in a comic view that the public might understand. Mickey Says. Here are some examples of Mickey Says. They implored more advertisement, they ridiculed non-paying subscribers, and bemoaned rising printing costs. Remember Rose's Scotch background. She didn't have to complain, she let the cartoon do it for her. When the Women's Club formed from the Old Town Improvement Society in 1913, Rose joined and became a big asset to the group. I think she must have looked up to Mrs. F.H. Gunther, the strong president of the group, for when Mrs. Gunther left office, Rose did not seem to be as active in the Women's Club. You can see the offices she held during this time. At another annual meeting, Mrs. Gunther would thank those that had been a major help to the organization, and she would always give Mrs. Rose Wilson special recognition. Special recognition is due to one of our members who perhaps more than any other has contributed to the success of the club. I refer to Mrs. C.V.S. Wilson, editor of the Sarasota Times. These pictures denote the building of the Women's Club in January 1915. The picture on the left, Mrs. Gunther is giving a speech. It looks like several of the Sarasota band were listening. The picture on the right was the laying of the cornerstone of the building. I believe Mrs. Gunther is where I have placed the green star, and also I presume Mrs. Rose Wilson is next to the red star. The cornerstone box contained the Women's Club 2-year books, the Women's Club edition of the Sarasota Sun newspaper, current issue of the Sarasota Times, the April 1914 issue of the Sarasota Times with the Women's Club annual report, Women's Club stationery with the officers' names, a picture of the Colonial Tea and postcard views of Park Work Day, a Buffalo nickel and 2 Lincoln pennies, and cards of members tied with club colors of red and green. Here is another picture of the Women's Club building, which held the library on the corner of today's North Palm Avenue and Coconut Avenue, which used to be Park Avenue. This slide shows the activity and advancement Rose had with the Order of the Eastern Star. She progressed from Ruth to worthy matron from 1914 to 1919. After serving as worthy matron, she and other past worthy matrons formed the Past Matrons Club in 1920, where she served as vice president. The building pictured is the Blackburn Block building. On the third floor was the Masonic Lodge where the Order of the Eastern Star met. This is on the corner of Lower Main Street and South Palm Avenue. Notice the fountain that used to be in the intersection. Rose was involved in other organizations. Annually, Rose would go to the Florida State Press Association meeting where she held the office of treasurer. She was a member of the Sarasota Board of Trade and a member of their publicity committee. After selling the Sarasota Times, she was involved with the funding committee for a new Presbyterian church with notables such as Ralph Capels and Calvin Payne, both rich snowbirds who loved Sarasota. One experience she seemed to love above the rest was a 15-minute flight with Lieutenant Whitted, 1,000 feet above Sarasota. The most agreeable surprise of this trip was that it could be taken without the slightest feeling of discomfort or uneasiness. Indeed, it seemed no more unnatural to be floating 1,000 feet over Sarasota than to take an auto trip down Main Street. Remember Rose's Scotch heritage. She didn't brag on herself. She did, however, appreciate when other editors appreciated her hard work at the Sarasota Times. I think the honor from the Tampa Times with the Who's Who honor as the first South Florida woman editor made her day. This is the end of the presentation. I hope you learned a little more about two wonderful women in Sarasota that took leadership roles about the same time in Sarasota's history.